not every field is equal in terms of how it performs or how much you expect it to perform. So you can unlock soil P and boost clover that you already have with lime. There's also a benefit there in terms of added N mineralization that can displace fertilizer requirement. We've seen again and again that protected urea does maintain grass growth when it's compared head to head with other forms of nitrogen, and it will also reduce emissions.
Hello and welcome to the Beef Edge, the Teagasc Beef podcast, for all your latest news, information and advice for Irish beef farmers. I'm Catherine Egan and this is our final recording from the Teagasc National Beef Conference with Teagasc researcher Dr Patrick Forrestal. Patrick outlines the practical nutrient management solutions which beef farmers can implement on their farm to increase efficiency, reduce costs and address environmental pressures facing the sector.
But I suppose the first thing I want to highlight and recognise is that your own knowledge of your farm, its soils, their aspect, the exposure and drainage, this is really, I suppose, fundamental knowledge that you are already using on your farms to make the best use of nutrients. And I suppose I want you to kind of take yourself onto your own farm in your thoughts, and you can think about which fields are the fields that maybe you target for silage, maybe that you can get out and graze early, the ones that you need to stay away from until later, or maybe the field that's not producing as much and maybe is delivering more on the biodiversity side. So I suppose this knowledge that you're already using is, I suppose, something that you can take the solutions that we'll talk about in this webinar and I suppose implement them using that knowledge. Maybe the silage ground, for instance, gets a bit more attention than another field, where to target first. And look at what will be covered is agronomic and environmental benefits of the use of lime, right? So an old technology, but new research is showing many additional benefits. I'll talk about protected urea, an important technology for us to get scores on the board in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions while still being able to maintain grass production. I'll talk about research that we've done on sulfur, which is showing agronomic benefits, but also nitrate leaching reduction benefits, and very new research on plantain inclusion, which is showing benefits in terms of maintaining yield, but also reducing nitrate leaching. And I suppose here's a few pictures to go along with these. You can see that sulfur benefit there on the right hand picture compared to the left hand, just the inclusion of sulfur. So I suppose that first question is around the pH of the fields on your farm. If you think to the fields of your own farm, do you know the soil pH of those fields? Maybe you've got information already from maybe participating in a scheme like the Department of Agriculture soil testing program. Maybe you have that information and it's just a case of digging it out, or maybe you need to prioritize doing some soil testing to establish the pH. For mineral soils of productive grassland, the target is really to be in the 6.3 to 6.5 range, and clover can benefit from those higher levels. If there's known issues around high molybdenum, then we don't recommend going above 6.2. And then for peat soils, the target is 5.5. So again, that knowledge that I referred to that you have of your own farm and your own fields is a critical part of implementing these solutions out on the landscape. In terms of liming benefits, the soils of Ireland, even just in the surface 10 centimetres, can have several hundred kilograms of total phosphorus there in the surface soil. However, much of that phosphorus is actually unavailable to the plant, the vast majority of it, in fact. But there are things that we can do to help to make that phosphorus that we already have more available. This is data from a trial that we conducted at Johnstown Castle, where we had a low pH soil and we added incremental levels of lime to achieve different levels of soil pH. You can see them here on the bottom axis going from 5 to 6.6. And on the vertical axis is the Morgan's soil test P, or the available P to the plant. And we see as we increase the soil pH, that plant available phosphorus levels are increasing, particularly when we go into above pH 6. And this means that, I suppose the tip that I have is you can unlock P that you already have with lime. So it's a good spend, and potentially given the potential to save on phosphorus fertilizer. It's not uncommon for the adding of lime to be able to jump you up or increase an index of availability. And indeed, any spend that you make on fertilizer, bagged fertilizer, P, that readily available P will be very vulnerable to being locked up if the pH isn't right. So I suppose lime is kind of a foundation. And also, I suppose in terms of nitrogen, fertilizer nitrogen, this is imported from outside of Ireland and in many cases outside of the EU. So we have this, I suppose, reliance in our system on this imported fertilizer. But there is the opportunity for us to work on, if you like, growing more of our own nitrogen using clover, for instance. And on the animal science side of the house in Teagasc, benefits have been seen there in terms of animal performance as well. But I suppose the first thing is being able to be successful with clover and to establish it. And here again, soil pH has an important influence. Again, this is a trial that we run where I direct drilled grass clover across blocks that had a range of soil pH from 5.5 to 6.8. And as you can see here, as the pH increased, the grass dry matter yield from those blocks also increased with increasing pH. So I suppose the tip that I have is, many swards will already have some clover in them. You can give them a boost using lime. And if you're going to establish new reseeds, most of which have some clover seed in them, you can lift the soil pH first. That's I suppose kind of a key first step. So it's not so valuable to come back afterwards. Try and get the pH up initially. And you might ask, well, is there any emissions benefit to doing all this? New research from Johnstown has also shown that as the soil pH was increased, the amount of nitrous oxide emissions coming from a fertilized soil are declining. So the tip is that correcting soil pH can also help reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the soil. I suppose moving into this area of fertilizer nitrogen sources and protected urea in particular, forms of nitrogen that you'll be familiar with using are likely to be standard straight urea and calcium ammonium nitrate, which is a mix of ammonium and nitrate. But what I've noticed since I joined Teagasc was that every year I get asked more questions about liquid fertilizers, and some farmers are, I suppose, working with these. And these tend to be a mix of these forms of N, but some of them have mainly urea content. And as part of a new Department of Agriculture project, I am with colleagues looking at the performance of a range of these fertilizers, standard and liquid fertilizers, with and without something called nitrification inhibitors, which have the potential to also reduce emissions further compared to standard, if you like, protected urea. And where did this, I suppose, push towards using more protected urea come from? About 10 years ago, we completed a body of research that involved about 70,000 gas measurements out over 2 years at 3 sites in Ireland. And what we saw was that comparing to CAN, there was a very substantial reduction in nitrous oxide emissions where we used urea-based nitrogens and in particular NBPT urea, which is that protection on the urea, about a 70% reduction in the emission factor. So look, the tip is that protected urea-based fertilizer, it has lower nitrous oxide emissions than CAN, and it can help us reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And I suppose every step that we can make to reduce those emissions kind of bring a good news story for agriculture in terms of showing that agriculture is doing its bit to reduce emissions. And also, I suppose the tip that's important is that you do need that protection with urea because it has the risk of losing some of its nitrogen as ammonia gas, which is the same gas that we're losing when we spread slurry, for example. And these urease inhibitors that we recommend are NBPT, NBPT plus NPPT, and 2-NPT to protect against that loss. A further insight that we've gained is that nitrate actually is a very strong driver of the loss of nitrous oxide in grassland soils. So actually we've done some work comparing straight nitrate, which is half of what's in CAN, to straight ammonium, which is the other half of what's in CAN, and we see that there is a substantial reduction in the emission factor from the ammonium part of the picture comparing to the nitrate. So the tip is that if you can select fertilizers that have less nitrate emissions, these tend to have lower nitrous oxide emissions. In fact, we're seeing evidence of this with some of the liquid fertilizers which have low levels of nitrate. But I suppose you might be thinking, maybe I don't have that many straight nitrogen slots in my program, but also the compounds such as 10-10-20 and 18-6-12, they have more ammonium relative to the nitrate concentration. So the selection of these type of compounds can also be a help. And there is development of, I suppose, protected urea-based compounds, so that space is developing at the moment. A question that has come up is, what about the performance of protected urea in the past year, which was challenging from growth on many farms. At Teagasc, we have this trial where we compare a range of fertilizers head to head under the same conditions, applied at the same time, at the same rate in a replicated setting. And these are data from the year gone by. And what we can see across the 6 cuts that are here, the lowest yield is for the bar on the left, which is the zero nitrogen control. But for the other treatments across the harvest, there was no significant difference in yield between the treatments. So in summary, all fertilizers, they grew the same. The choice of fertilizer didn't have an impact on yield within harvest. And I should say that this site was challenged by many of the similar challenges that other sites have had around the country. So in the spring, it was very wet all the way up into April. And then when we came to June, July, and August, we had soil moisture deficits that were reaching the levels that were restricting grass growth. And when we pull all this together for the response for the entire year, what we see is that the grass dry matter yield from the fertilizers in total wasn't significantly different between the fertilizers. Obviously, the zero nitrogen control was lower, but there was no effective fertilizer choice. Insofar as one could venture to say that there are any differences, I've ranked them numerically, with urea having numerically the lowest yield all the way on the left, and urea plus 2 NPT having the highest yield. CAN and urea plus NPT gave about 2% extra yield over standard urea. And as I mentioned, as part of this Department of Agriculture funded project, we're looking at emissions and performance of a range of different fertilizers, I suppose all the way from CAN, which has a lot of nitrate, through liquids, which have less nitrate. So that's the red section of these bars here, and the proportion of nitrate in the fertilizers, all the way to the urea fertilizers, which have very little nitrate. We're also looking at the addition of nitrification inhibitors to these, and we are seeing additional benefits here. And I suppose as that work kind of comes to fruition, more will come out about this. Another challenge that we have is around the whole nitrate leaching side and river nitrate quality. This is an area that I suppose agriculture is striving to make improvements in, and there's a couple of pieces from the recent research that can help in this regard. So on the left here, we see this picture of response to sulfur, and you can see that visual benefit of the sulfur here at this site. And I suppose that's a good benefit in terms of the agronomic side, but I'll also talk about some of the leaching effects. And we've done this work with the inclusion of plantain in grass clover swards. So I suppose to get into these, a range of responses to sulfur, we've seen a range of responses to sulfur across soils. And again, this goes back to what I was speaking about at the beginning. Your knowledge of your own fields and what kind of soil you have can be important here. So we saw a range of responses, anything from 5 or 6% to all the way up to 37% response in this particular cutting setting. The soils on the right here, which gave the highest level of response, so the green bar relative to the red bar, which had no nitrogen, so the bar all the way on the right relative to the middle bar. These were the lighter, sandier or sandy loam, free draining soils, and these tended to have the higher levels of response. The heavier soils tended to give a more limited response, but that wasn't always the case. So I suppose the tip that I have really around this is, try and get a sense of the level of S response that's likely on your soils. And your knowledge of whether your soils are light and free draining or heavier will give you an indication of that. If they're light and free draining, you might need a little bit more sulfur. If you're on the heavier side, maybe a little bit less. But what we can say is that for silage ground in particular, where you've got this cutting occurring, it is important to include sulfur, particularly for the first cut, I would say, and maybe targeting in the range 15 to 20 kilograms per hectare. So that's 12 to 16 units. In the grazing setting then, where you've got that extra, recycling occurring, for soils that are on the lighter side, maybe they're going to need 3, 4, maybe 5 rounds of sulfur spread out over the course of the year. And then for the heavier soils or soils that are not responding as strongly, maybe a couple of rounds is adequate. I suppose I'd hesitate to say put more sulfur everywhere on all soils, because there can be negative interactions with selenium uptake, for example. So just bear this in mind. But we do see also a benefit on the nitrate leaching side, and this is really important for us at present. What you're looking at here, this line that's going across, this is the drinking water quality standard. So look, this is not a target, but it gives us a threshold to compare programs that had sulfur versus programs that did not have sulfur. And what we see here is that by adding sulfur to the treatments, we see that the nitrate leaching concentrations coming out the bottom of these lysimeters is reduced below that threshold in all cases, actually, for the treatments that had sulfur. And in terms of the amount of nitrogen leached out of these, the addition of sulfur, where we were using slurry and fertilizer N, was about 50 kilograms nitrate N reduction in the leaching. For the fertilizer only treatment with sulfur, we were reducing by about 22 kilograms, which actually took us to very similar levels, the same, not significantly different, to where we applied no fertilizer. So I suppose hopefully this theme is kind of coming across, that by the selection of the fertilizer type that we use, by the management of fertilizer, we can actually reduce our emissions very substantially and losses very substantially, in some cases to levels similar to where we don't apply any fertilizer. And I think this is very powerful. Look, in terms of nitrate leaching reductions, this work that we've done looking at the benefits of rhubarb plantain inclusion in swards where we added a target population of 30% plantain or 50% plantain to grass clover sward, has just been accepted for publication. So the evidence base is there across 5 soils and 2 years this work was done. I'll just give one example here. We did see the benefits across soils, but one example here, graph, again, this drinking water quality standard is running, it's the line that you see here. The highest peaks that we're seeing are for the grass clover treatment, but with the inclusion of plantain, those nitrate concentrations are markedly reduced. So I think this gives us, I suppose it gives us hope in terms of new solutions that have promise for the future, for potential incorporation in swards to reduce those emissions. So I suppose just to summarize what we've been talking about tonight, look at thinking again back to your own farm and the soils of your own farm and the individual fields even, right? So you yourselves know that not every field is equal in terms of how it performs or how much you expect it to perform. So you can unlock soil P and boost clover that you already have with lime. There's also a benefit there in terms of added N mineralization that can displace fertilizer requirement. We've seen again and again that protected urea does maintain grass growth when it's compared head to head with other forms of nitrogen, and it will also reduce emissions. The use of sulfur to boost grass growth and reduce nitrate leaching is also a new tool that's important, and I suppose optimizing that for your own farm is something that I suppose you can work on with this guidance that the lighter soils tend to be more responsive to sulfur than the heavier soils, but all soils at the moment are going to need some level of sulfur addition. New research showing that plantain inclusion reduces nitrate leaching while maintaining yields, I suppose gives a kind of, I suppose, just to flag that as a new option there that's coming forward. And I want to acknowledge, to finish up, my research team, colleagues and collaborators, without whom this work wouldn't have come to fruition, and also very importantly the funding support that we've received from the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, also the Teagasc Walsh Scholarship Programme and the European Union. So with that, I'll bring it to a close.
That's all for this week, and you can catch up on all other recordings from the National Beef Conference and proceedings on the Teagasc website, and I'll include the link in the podcast text. You can catch up on all other shows and interviews from the Beef Edge podcast on the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie, or you can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe so you never miss a show. For all other updates from our beef programme, keep an eye on our Twitter and Facebook pages. Until next time, I'm Catherine Egan, and thanks for listening.